I keep finding myself in relationships that don't really serve me very well. I went through a reasonably painful divorce. That pattern of meeting someone, falling, I guess, head over heels and ignoring a number of red flags, as they say, almost losing myself in the relationship.
Most of the time, we don't actually love the person. We love how they make us feel. Two halves don't make a whole in relationships.
A real sustainable relationship isn't going to be based on just seeking that euphoria, that romance, that chemistry. It's actually going to be based on that long-term vision. Hi, I'm Hayden Brown. I'm a human behavior specialist, and I help people resolve the root cause of their long-term patterns and emotional challenges so they can start living more purposeful and fulfilling lives.
Hi, I'm Greg, a life and business design coach, and I help business owners and leaders design a life they genuinely love so they can live with intention, freedom, and by design, not default.
The goal of Breakthrough is to help you create real changes in your life. We do this by helping you uncover the why behind why you're stuck, help you gain clarity in what you truly want, and give you the tools to get there. With that said, let's get into the show. Greg, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. Looking forward to today and enjoyed the previous episodes. Had a bit of a fail this week. We're in the caravan and I left the skylight. We went out for a bit and I left the skylight roof windows open. Big downpour of rain soaked all the carpets, everything inside. And so we had to do a big clean up and dry, but that's rookie caravanning 101 lesson. We'll not be doing that again.
And how does the wife feel about that?
Yeah, we just made it work. I think we're each going to have our own number of accidents in the caravan and things we're learning. So enough grace there to not be angry about it. But
yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, how about you,
mate? I'm good, thank you. I'm good. Nothing. Much of a muchness for me this week. Maybe as you've probably noticed, and maybe the viewers are seeing, playing around with some different lighting options and whatnot on the set, which is quite exciting, being such a long time journey getting to this point. So now just those little tweaks and refinements. But other than that, I'm good. Jamie, the question, the caller, please, for this week, what have you got for us?
Yeah, no, I'm good too, thanks. Today we have Steve, who submitted a question and voice note, and the question is, why do I lose myself in relationships?
Wow, that's a good one. I definitely relate to that one. Looking forward to diving into the topic today. So what's your initial thoughts on why we might lose ourselves in relationships?
Yeah, what a relatable question, right? I see, you acknowledge you can relate to that. I think certainly myself in high school, a lot of relatability for me. And I think also, I assume when we perhaps hear the voice note, we're going to find that it's a bit more perhaps romantic relationships is my sort of intuitive thoughts there. But also, whether it's romantic relationships, friendships, maybe work colleagues, I would suggest this is quite a far-reaching question, right? Very rarely nothing happens in isolation. Why do we, who are we? And then if so, are we being influenced by other people's values or those idealisms? And then, of course, the ripple effect of that and how that can negatively impact our life. So that is something that you can relate to.
Definitely. Yeah. I think on a personal level, I think expanding there on friend groups or different environments, we can mold ourselves into different people depending on who we're with. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. I've definitely done that. But more thinking about romantic relationship for me personally, I've been married a number of years, and I think there's the intention to try and what do they need? How do you be a good partner, be a good spouse?
Yeah.
And in doing that, you can continually be asking that question, what do they need, or who do I need to be? And so you go, well, I think, like, who am I and what do I need? You can lose some of that if you're doing that. I think for anyone that's a current people pleaser or recovering people pleaser, you are used to asking, who do I need to be, or how do I
need to show up
in this environment? And you can lean strongly into roles. So I identify with that and probably done that many, many years. And then there's learning to not do that takes a bunch of time to individuate. You go, who am I?
Yes.
What do I actually enjoy? And getting back in touch with that stuff.
Yes.
So plenty of stuff I'm looking forward to diving into.
And Greg, I just to speak to that quickly, I love that term individuate or individuation, which is a Jungian term, Jungian psychology, which talks about, this journey of coming into yourself as an individual. And, over the course of our life or our self-development, becoming clear on our identity, our values, which is obviously, it may be informed by our parents and voids, but is obviously our own identity and values, which is separate from the social ideals or collective unconscious or conscious that so much of us grow up trying to fit in for. So I think, from a self-development perspective, I've always loved that term individuation. Jung would say it's a journey of a lifetime to become who you truly are. And what a privilege that is. But no, look, the last thing I'll just say is I think, I work with so many clients and they will often say, I don't know who I am. I've never known who I am. And it's such a relatable challenge or pattern, like I said, whether it's personal relationships or intimate relationships. And I think sometimes it's acknowledging that perhaps that's never been our priority, right? Perhaps our priority has been conflict avoidance, people pleasing, wearing this mask for others, building this identity around external success, which is actually different to who are we, and then ultimately not losing ourselves in any given relationship. So beautiful question.
Yeah, if I can just say one more thing there. You mentioned there about Jung, and I know that's not your primary frame only, but obviously he's got some great things to say. Understanding around the how he frames the first half and second half of life, being typically the first half being the formation of the persona and the roles and who I need to be to function in the world. And if you find a way that does function well, you tend to gravitate towards that and stick to that and often think that is you. And then as he describes, often in the middle of life around some stage or a crisis happens of some sort,
yes.
Then you go, I've been trying to be all these things, but they didn't work or they're not working anymore. If I'm not those things and those aren't who I truly am, then who the heck am I? And you end up going, well, if I'm not those, I can, it's quite destabilizing. You end up feeling like you're in this, what often gets called a midlife crisis, where I think people can gravitate back to the certainty that they constructed. Well, I'll just double down on those things. Or there's this courageous journey of working out, well, what do I truly value? Who am I really? And I really enjoy chatting with people in that space where they go, I know I don't want how I have been living, but I don't yet know what I want or who I am for the next stage of life. There's a big journey there.
Yes, and for anyone who can relate to that straight off the bat, or maybe they've been through a bit of an existential crisis like this, and I know you and I have talked about this before as well, Greg, on previous episodes, that actually having it where we do have this disproportionate challenge or crisis, whatever you want to label it, trauma, whatever you want to label it, to be able to have an event that perhaps is so destabilizing to our persona, to the masks, to the coping strategies, is that a bad thing, right? My mentor would say that, maximum growth occurs on the border of support and challenge. So we need the two, right? And often, and this is obviously the one of the goals of the show, right? To blend the self-development with the depth or root cause psychology, because often we look at all of this great self-development and we're looking at layering on these so-called good or beneficial things, but it's under the wrong foundation. And so having an identity crisis or, some sort of event that really reveals to us maybe the castle that we've built that hasn't been around our own most authentic self or most authentic values. I would probably say that's actually the average client that comes to me. They've gone through this challenge or existential crisis, and now we're actually revealing who they authentically are. So all of that said, Jamie, could we please have the voice note, please?
Oh, hi, Hayden. It's Steve here. Thanks for taking my question. The main issue I've got, I guess, at the moment is I keep finding myself in relationships that don't really serve me very well. I went through a reasonably painful divorce, and pretty much that pattern of meeting someone, falling, I guess, head over heels and ignoring a number of red flags, as they say, almost losing myself in the relationship. and so it's happened a couple of times now. And then, but when coming out, being almost, I don't know, unable to stop myself getting into another one. And I guess it's almost like a euphoria when you sort of meet this next person and so on, and almost straight away you start plotting this life ahead of you and how that all looks. I mean, logically, it's almost, when you look back, it's almost bizarre, but there's just this really strong drive to do that. It's a very negative impact because, as I say, you sort of lose yourself in the relationship, and it doesn't, when it ends, it's obviously very painful. So I guess what I'm hoping to get out of the conversation with yourself is, I don't know, just trying to understand why. As I say, logically, it doesn't seem to make any sense, and I can see that, but it just almost can't stop. I'm not really sure. I don't think I'm afraid of it. It's not loneliness, I don't think. So I'm not really sure where to go. Okay. Let us know how we get on.
What a powerful question, and thank you to Steve for sharing that. Where I'd like to start, Greg, I mean, he obviously said the core tenet of the question, and obviously looking at the next best steps for Steve is obviously going to be looking at what is the why driving this, right? And where I would start with that is a couple of key words that sort of stood out to me, right? This euphoria, right? This euphoria-like feeling that's really driving him forward, and that is common to these relationships or to that pattern. Also the idea of infatuation, right? So seeing or projecting out more positives than negatives onto this individual that the caller may be seeing. And in doing that and being in an infatuated state and seeing more perceived positives than negatives, we're overlooking certain red flags. And whether they're red flags in the sort of cliche way that many sort of pop psychology people speak about it, or whether they're just simply ways that you're not aligned with your values or you want different things in life. I think the first thing is just recognizing that as humans, we do tend to get infatuated. We do tend to project certain ideals onto ourselves and others. I know you and I have spoke about fantasies in previous episodes, which is a core tenet. And so I think the first thing there for those listening is, hopefully there's some relatability to think, in your own relationships, again, personally or professionally or intimate relationships, is there a cycle of this infatuation or fantasy driving you forward? And what are you projecting onto the other people of who you want them to be? Or perhaps what what this fantasy or scenario is that you're expecting will come from this relationship that isn't actually honoring who they are, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. That idea of euphoria, I think there is a beautiful part of love or falling in love that we get to experience some of that. But also, if it's built primarily around seeking that, there's a real challenge with that. I read something a while ago that was really confronting because I think it's just so systemic in how we see love and falling in love. And the challenge was that most of the time we don't actually love the person. We love how they make us feel. So we're actually falling in love with the feeling that we have, which is actually a love of self, as opposed to a love for the other person. And we can say, we're both falling in love with each other, but often I think both parties are falling in love with the feeling of how the other person makes them feel.
Yes.
So I think that can also speak to the euphoria that you feel. And then when it is not that, you go, well, what have we got left? Because I thought that was, I know we're going deep talking about love, but essentially seeking that feeling as opposed to another definition I heard of love that I thought was succinct and great was seeking the benefit of the other for their own good, which is this, this is towards you for your own benefit, but it's not self-seeking in that primary way. And I think it's a healthy thing to want romance, to want that elated feeling. But I think like he's saying, that you go, I don't want to see red flags. I don't want anything to disrupt this feeling because I want it to feel like that. And I want it to stay like that. But that's not often, the idea of the honeymoon period of experience is maybe also what gets bumped into. And then you go, what is this built on when that feeling dissipates.
That's beautiful, Greg. I love that. But yeah, I think, to add to that, I think, there is this human side of things where, we do get infatuated easily, and there is that honeymoon effect. And so, let's not that let's be real here, that does happen, probably with many individuals that do have a great sustainable relationship that isn't primarily founded on infatuation. But I think it's looking at, as you said, is that the foundation, and sort of catching yourself with, as we spoke about in previous episodes, what is that underlying fuel source? We've spoke about a lot already, and this will be a core tenet of that pain or pleasure, right? Pain or pleasure, pride or shame, the fantasy or the nightmare, because perceptions deal in complementary opposites, okay? So again, what are we trying to avoid and what are we trying to seek? And, anyone who is in, a fulfilling marriage or partnership will tell you that there is, there is challenges, there is resentment, there is pushback. And I think really what that speaks to, again, is this integrating of the opposites, right? So, there is going to be challenges, there is going to be triggers. It's not just going to be this fantasy or projection of who you want them to be or how you think the relationship should be, but it's actually grounded in the integration of both of those opposites, right? And I think oftentimes that can be so counter to, the culture around relationships, or what we see on the Disney movies, so to speak, which is often primarily, infatuation and all support, no challenge, or we're on the same page with everything. And so I think, I would suggest, a real sustainable relationship isn't going to be based on just seeking that euphoria, that romance, that chemistry. It's actually going to be based on that long-term vision. Again, that values-driven purpose. You have the individual identities, and then also a shared identity or vision in the relationship or marriage. And in doing that, as we spoke about in other episodes, having more resilience and adaptability for the challenges along the way, because you're not expecting a one-sided outcome.
Yeah, really powerful. You mentioned at the end there about having two individual identities and then having a shared identity. Something I heard in my teens that I found really helpful was the idea that two halves don't make a whole in relationships, which is I'm incomplete and I'm seeking for that to be completed in someone else, which leads to the pursuit. But to the extent that I can be whole in a healthy way, we're always going to have that part that we do seek a relationship. But to the extent that I can be more whole, I then bring that into a relationship. Keen to hear your thoughts on that, with like an individuation, each person having an identity and then a shared identity, as opposed to going, I don't know. I'm just picking up a little bit with Steve saying there's this drive for the next relationship, or like I'm drawn towards that, how important that individual identity is.
Yes. Yeah. And look, we're going to come back to this idea of, what are we running from? Because again, if we're seeking this euphoria, this pleasure, often unconsciously, but again, there is, evidence of that, as the caller Steve said. What are we seeking, but also what are we wanting to avoid? And I would suggest that probably the most common thing I see in these dynamics is there's these deep-seated self-judgments on ourselves, whether it's, past trauma or past pain, certain beliefs that we may carry about ourselves, right? I'm not good enough, or, I'll be good when I have the attractive wife, the successful husband, whatever it is. And so, oftentimes we have to really audit these beliefs, and are our past experiences actually informing, again, what we are projecting out in these fantasy scenarios of what we're wanting to get from our spouse. And, you mentioned, about being whole, going back to Jung again, there's another Jungian quote that I love, which is, I would rather be whole than good, which I think is really powerful in the sense where if you really think about that, not looking for someone to, agree with you on everything, to disproportionately support you, but actually setting up a relationship that isn't based on this infatuation of both of you being this one-sided person, all good, no bad, all support, no challenge, etc., but actually based on a foundation of all sides of yourself, honoring all parts of yourself. My mentor, Dr. DeMartini, would say that we all have all traits. So we're all kind, kind, considerate, inconsiderate, on time, late. We all have all parts within ourselves. And oftentimes we've had these experiences where we judge ourselves or society judges us. We push these parts of ourselves down, and then we bring all this baggage into our relationship. And so we don't want to show these parts of ourselves to our spouse, or we project these parts of ourselves that we resent, and thus we seek onto them, looking for them to be that person to essentially base our self-worth on. And then again, we come back to, is this pattern here based on actually a shared vision of actually both wanting a similar direction, be it family or career or lifestyle, whatever that is, or is it actually based on looking for this sort of one-sided acknowledgement or affirmation from each other, really to compensate from past wounds or self-judgments?
Yeah, that's massive. I think that if I can reflect something there, where you're saying that we all have all things, or we have things that are positive, things that are negative. A way I think about that is, if you have an ideal of someone and who you want them to be, or maybe need them to be, or you've used the word a fantasy of who that person is. Do you think that can stop you seeing the reality of that person?
Absolutely.
You mentioned, I miss these red flags and that sort of thing, which is an idealized version of the person. And you mentioned that there's maybe potentially pain that is the other side of the pleasure, or the, I forget your language there, that leads to the dream state that you want. It's reflecting, I don't want this, or I'm running from this, but I really want or kind of need you to be this person.
Yes.
You can project, you are that person, you're finally that person. Love for you to explain a bit more about that, how that happens. I mean, would you agree with that you project kind of an idealized version? I think we all tend to do that, especially initially at the start of a relationship.
Yes. Well, look, I mean, absolutely. And often it's, and look, I get this impression with the caller, Steve, perhaps I think he said he's just come out of this divorce, and now perhaps with the beauty of hindsight, he's able to reflect on that and maybe other relationships and see that he has, overlooked certain red flags or misalignment in values or direction perhaps. And of course, that is growth, and the individuation process we spoke about in itself right there. But look, I mean, when we're in this state, and we do have these unconscious dynamics or programming playing out, we're highly incentivized to overlook these red flags, because we're trying to seek a pleasure without a pain. We're looking for this one-sided fantasy. When I talk about a fantasy, really what I'm talking about is trying to get a pain without a pleasure. And, whether that's in business or in a relationship.
Oh, sorry, the other way around, trying to get a pleasure without a pain.
I'm not trying to make correction.
I'm trying to not get a pain without a pleasure. Yeah.
No, actually, that's crucial. Absolutely. So thank you, Greg. Trying to get the pleasure without the pain, right? And, oftentimes in other areas of our life where maybe these wounds or these trauma responses aren't playing out, perhaps it's business. We might know that we were very invested in growing our business, but we know it's going to be challenging and we need to challenge ourselves, and maybe it's public speaking or leadership. And we know that that's tough, but we embrace that because it's meaningful and purposeful. And so oftentimes at a high level, logically, if we're able to check ourselves in a different area of our life, we don't expect that pleasure without a pain, and we integrate the two. But then there may be another area of our life, such as the relationships, that represent a past wound or a feeling of not feeling good enough, whatever that is for Steve or the individual. And then, of course, we are defaulting into this position where we are expecting a one-sided outcome from ourself, the relationship, or simply, again, how we're expecting them to act, or how we are trying to present ourselves to them. And, just going a little bit further on that, it's obviously a lot here we could speak to, Greg, but one of the most common things that I like to get my clients to see is to take some ownership on, it's very easy to, look at, this, my partner or my husband was a narcissist, or every person I go out with is a narcissist, very, very common. But also, what's been the parts in you that has allowed that, or has not communicated your needs from day one, or has set up that foundation perhaps. And that isn't giving the other person a free pass by any means, but it's going, hold on, perhaps are you the variable here, right? Are you the variable here? And again, are you overlooking certain red flags or projecting those fantasies onto them that then actually sets up this relationship that isn't based on equity or isn't sustainable. And so I think a bit of reflection sometimes as well, because it's very easy. I mean, the call of Steve sounds self-aware of owning his part in it and wanting to get some answers there. But I think for a lot of people listening, maybe a first step would also be looking at, if there is resentment to past relationships, what has been their part of how they're expecting their partner to show up, or even themselves, and were those foundations set up based on a vision, or based on these voids that we're trying to avoid and compensate for.
Well, there's so much awesome stuff there. I would love to take it into the Steve mentioned about feeling not sure where this is coming from, and just going a bit into why he might be stuck. One of the things you mentioned was around personal beliefs, or like I'll be good when I'll feel good about myself when, or some sort of beliefs like that. Be keen to hear a bit more about that, with his early attachment patterns or beliefs that might have been formed somewhere.
Yeah. So earlier in the show, Greg, we spoke about, when we have these, existential, crisis or really big pains, that they often reveal, the wounds underneath, or the coping strategies fall away. And, I would actually circle back to that in the sense that, if Steve is, say, recently divorced or going separated, I would almost want him to reflect on what are some of those, how does he feel in his body, perhaps when he's confronted, with some of that, right? Maybe he's, there's a specific memory and he's really having to reconcile that this relationship didn't work. And in doing that, there will be a real opportunity to actually start to trace back perhaps some of the core wounds. And so, from a somatic therapy approach that often looks at, the body, what is the feeling in the body? And are there other, what I would say to take that further is, if you can isolate the more recent pain and how that actually feels, the triggers, what that brings up, and also even the self-talk or the beliefs that might be coming in that, in that moment of pain, and to be able to reflect back and go, where is that a common feeling? Where have I felt this way before? And, oftentimes I find that, clients I work with are extremely surprised to know just how early back these things trace. It's not necessarily going to be one moment. If there's a good degree of self-awareness, you'll likely find multiple moments. And then again, we layer on top of ourselves these fantasies or these coping strategies of, okay, that is an unbearable pain. That's very uncomfortable. I'm going to push that away and I'm going to strive for X success. Or again, when I have my partner, I'll feel good enough, or when I make X money. So I think to your question of identifying where that comes from is, I would actually suggest there's a real opportunity to lean into that pain there, or reflect on that in a more meaningful way. And like I said, take some ownership rather than just, blame and project onto the spouse perhaps, or the ex further on how they didn't meet your unrealistic expectations. Actually look a little bit deeper in yourself, and what was the negative self-talk, the self-judgments, what was happening in your body. And is there past experiences? Maybe you recall feeling alone in high school. Maybe it was a first relationship at 15, 16, and, she ended it abruptly. Looking at actually what that brings up. And I find that oftentimes people are very surprised just how influential earlier life events can be. But if you think about it from the perspective, the brain is always trying to keep us safe. We're actually hardwired to store this in our unconscious and in our body. And so recognizing where we're actually acting from the past, which obviously conflicts with us actually acting purposefully from a values-driven approach of actually what's that vision for a partner, not what is avoiding the past pain that we've gone through.
Great. Yeah, to make sure I understand. So you're saying there's an opportunity to sit with the feeling, sit with the pain that Steve might be experiencing, or anyone who's listening that's gone through similar things, and actually allow a bit of time to explore, are there previous times that I felt this way, or is this harking back to something that was earlier in life with a painful experience? Is that looking for a similar experience where just pain might have happened relationally or otherwise, and then what you might have told yourself as a result? Is there a belief you might have picked up, or do you have any examples? It doesn't have to be client stuff, but what might be a belief that someone might pick up as a result
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the beliefs can be very, I probably almost wouldn't direct us to the beliefs there, just because that can be so multifaceted. But perhaps what would be more of an action-orientated exercise for the listeners or watchers would be looking at, if you're able to identify where are those past same or similar experiences of that feeling or of that self-judgment, to then actually look back and go, what did I put in place to avoid that pain then?
Gotcha.
Right. So then we can actually look at where did that coping strategy start. And so again, it might be, I'm never going to show my full self again so I don't get hurt. Or, okay, I was rejected then by this woman that I really cared about. How successful or humorous or what value do I need to offer the world to not be in that position again? And so I would suggest the next level to that would be recognizing where it may come from, where there's some similarities in that feeling or that self-judgment or judgment on other, by the way. It may be a common pattern of the relationship ends and you're finding yourself judging the other person. Like I said, taking some ownership in that. But then looking at perhaps unconsciously what you put in place to actually avoid that. And just for the listeners here, because again, this is very deep work. I'm not suggesting that that's obvious, and I'm not even suggesting that was a conscious conversation of, okay, I'm not suggesting that Steve said to himself at 9, 10 years old, all right, I must do X to avoid Y. But again, the brain wants to keep us safe, and we will naturally look to avoid pain and seek pleasure in the absence of purpose and a values-driven approach. And so I think starting to reflect on, if I look at the evidence, what did I start to do differently, or how did my life redirect to avoid that pain? And if you can connect those dots to start to see how, yes, there may have been benefits and you may have, become more empowered in your career, or you may have, elevated yourself or grown or developed certain strengths in many ways. So let's not say it's all negative. But actually, maybe that coping strategy has passed its expiry date, Greg. Maybe it's passed its expiry date, or maybe it serves us in business, but that same approach isn't going to serve us in our relationships. And so checking ourselves, with some reflection, where is this coming from? What did I put in place to avoid this? Will allow you to understand all of the coping strategies, all of the ways that we've shut down certain parts of ourselves and tried to present a certain persona that's unrealistic, or, to our spouse, or project that onto them. To be able to see that and unearth that is everything. So I think there's a bit to that. It's a layered approach, but I think even if there was any degree of insight to any one of those three, that would be huge. Lastly, just to round this off, Greg, bonus answer, if you will, would be, I think there's a real opportunity here for Steve to actually perhaps do some journaling, to actually write out, what is most important to him, and what would a relationship that supports that looks like, right? There's obviously, a vulnerability of, as he said, when he starts dating, he can get infatuated, he can project all this onto them. And I do really believe becoming conscious of the unconscious that we just went through will go a long way to having more emotional mastery and freedom in that regard. So I don't want to understate that. But, the other part and the other tenet to the show is, what do you actually want, right? How do you get there, which we've looked at, but what do you actually want? And so I think taking some time perhaps to look at what's important to him, right? What does he love to learn about? What are his longest term goals? What gives him energy? These are the sort of questions I start with determining one's values or purpose priorities. And then looking at that as a starting point and looking at what would a really rewarding or meaningful relationship that had a shared vision in that area, what would that look like? Okay. And it's not going to be a fantasy where they disproportionately support it and don't challenge it. They're going to have their own values and purpose that they're dedicated to. It's not going to be the same. But what would it look like where you can actually have a shared purpose and support each other in both values, and starting to define that so that you can perhaps have a clearer frame and a clearer sense of purpose in a relationship instead of the past projection.
Yeah, really powerful. I think part of my journey has been experiencing a lot of what Steve has been talking about, which is collapsing into a relationship, or collapsing myself into a relationship in that way. And I can relate with a bunch of the things you're saying. I think I picked up to be a good partner in a relationship means X, Y, Z. And so reading books and learning how to do that. And then so you're literally asking, who do I need to be in order to be effective as a good partner, as a good husband, those sorts of things. And then that, if you ask that question, like you're saying, what would a great healthy relationship look like that you'd really want? I would definitely say, well, I would want both myself and them to be able to be themselves. That would be a key part in getting to know the actual person and them getting to know you. And then you realize, well, if I'm not being myself by trying to be this version of myself, and I have a version of them as well that I'm trying to hold on to. As someone said to me, we're having a conversation about it, and they said, you don't really have a relationship then. And I said, what do you mean? Well, they said, well, it's not a relationship with you.
Wow.
Who's it a relationship with? And is realizing they have a relationship with my representative self. They have a relationship with my role.
With your sales rep.
With my sales rep.
Literally.
Yeah. And you go, well, what's the downside of that? And you go, man, we don't have, and the upside was, I think to your point there as well, is, well, what is there to lose then? Because you go, well, if I share what I honestly feel or start engaging in that way, the risk is genuine then that they may not like me or accept me or love me as I am, and it goes both ways. You go, and their challenge to me was, but you're only losing what wasn't real anyway.
Wow.
So the idea that what you go, this is, I need to maintain this. And it was, well, what you're maintaining is false. It's fake. And I think there's a healthy place where we ask, how do I operate well in a relationship? But that was very helpful to me to realize, to the way you describe it, I was letting go of a fantasy in order to embrace reality. And that's the same in friendships. Would you rather have people that actually know, if you have a representative self that shows up in friendships, then you actually don't have friendships. And if they're doing the same, you're both sending out your representative self to meet with their representative self, and you can feel very isolated and alone. You go, that's strange. We went out for beers and we chatted and we've had these interactions and adventures together, but somehow I feel disconnected. And so that's just a bit of personal experience.
And you have to embrace the fear to get to that state, right? So acknowledging this, whether it's fear of rejection, fear of being alone, fear of not being good enough, well, those fears will inform the persona or the sales rep that's going out there. And so you have to lean into that fear, and I think take some ownership that it's not sustainable. It is responsible for these relationship breakdowns, for these patterns, and to lean into that. I mean, I would suggest, Greg, I'm curious your thoughts, but I think the key messages for today, really from my perspective, is, what is the foundation that you're building your relationships on? Again, is it your own purpose and a shared purpose there, or is it this pain avoidance and projection? And I've heard people say that the most terrifying idea is to accept oneself completely. And it is. And so we unconsciously do it to ourselves. We are so judging of ourselves. We are so, critical of ourselves. We've had these experiences where we're told we weren't good enough, or that anger doesn't have a place, or we have to act a certain way. And so we do it to ourselves, oftentimes unconsciously, by trying to conform. And then we bring that to our relationships by actually going, okay, I have to show this side and not this, and I project that onto them as well. And so I think the key message for today for the listeners is, what is the foundations you're building your relationship on, looking at what's most important to you, and owning your patterns and your part in where you're projecting those fantasies that aren't sustainable.
Awesome. There's so many things there that hopefully for Steve you'll be able to use. I know for me personally, a great takeaway from that is being able to have a look at where I might be operating still in certain areas, because it's not just one and done, one thing, where I still might be operating from pain avoidance, and there's certain behaviors that mean, or if I just operate that way, maybe I could avoid that pain or have a sense of control or security, and at what cost. So yeah. Journaling time for me, I think.
Absolutely.
Some good things in there.
Look, I think, absolutely. It's a journey. It's not just one thing. And I think hopefully a lot of value for listeners today around auditing, some of the why behind the pattern. And again, what are those foundations? Thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of Breakthrough. Please, if you haven't liked and subscribed, do us that favor, follow us, help get the show out there more. And if you've had a breakthrough moment of your own, leave us a comment and let us know, or even what you'd love to see more of. Until next time.